There are a lot of great retro handheld emulators under $100. You got the Miu Mini Plus, the RG35XX, the RG35XX Plus, the H, the 2024. They're really running with that name anyway. But one little quirk, one little asterisk that a lot of these handhelds have is that they're great if you're willing to put custom firmware on them. At least that's what the community says. The Miu Mini Plus is awesome if you take the time to put Onion OS on it. Oh, the RG35XX is great if you use Garlic OS and not the stock OS. Well, what if I told you there's a handheld under $100 that's going to be great out of the box without having to install any custom firmware? And that is where we have the Trimui Smart Pro. Look, it's got RGB lighting, so you know it's good. This is the Trimui Smart Pro, or Trimui? Pretty sure it's Trimui because it's got UI in the word, and this thing has a UI, so I'm gonna go with that. A while back they released their Trimui Smart, which is a very small pocketable device that is pretty okay. I've never used it myself, but I've heard it's alright for what you're getting. Well, Trimui decided to step things up and release the Smart Pro, which is a larger, more fleshed out Pro version of the Trimui Smart. And I gotta say, this thing is probably my favorite one of these I've reviewed so far. By the way, full disclosure, I was sent this out for review, but it does not affect my opinion in any way. I will have an affiliate link in the description from Amazon, but this video is not sponsored or paid in any other way other than if you happen to use that link. The Smart Pro can usually be found for under $100. The Amazon listing I'll have linked in the description has the 64GB version for $99 in black or white, or you can get the 256GB version for an additional $30. Inside the box you get an instruction card, the Smart Pro itself, a USB-A to USB-C charging cable, and the micro SD card. It's got a 4.96-inch IPS 720p display. A lot of the popular sub $100 systems have a 480p screen or lower, so this nice big 720p screen looks very nice and is very much welcome. For the processor, it's got a 1.8 GHz all-winner A133 Plus, and it has a 5000 mAh battery, which should get you around 5 to 6 hours of battery life. You have your D-pad, left thumbstick, and the menu button on the left, face buttons, right thumbstick, and start and select on the right. Along the top you have stacked shoulder buttons and triggers, which is nice, your power button, a host USB-C port, and a volume rocker. Along the bottom you have the function switch, which I'll get to in a moment, this gray pad, which I'm unsure of what it does, there's nothing about it in the manual, the USB-C charging port, a microphone, a single micro SD card slot, and a headphone jack. The OS and firmware and all that is all on the internal storage, so the SD card is just going to be for your games and some other files. The D-pad feels nice and tactile and responsive. No accidental diagonals here, however it is a little hard sometimes to pull off intentional diagonals as well. I tested this out in Street Fighter 2 for the Super Nintendo, and I kinda had a hard time consistently pulling off quarter circles. The face buttons are also pretty nice, they feel very similar to the D-pad, again responsive and tactile. I do have an issue on my copy where the X button kinda sticks sometimes and feels a little stiff. It works every time I press it, but I am kinda worried it might break down the line. If it isn't obvious, this thing does look very heavily inspired by the PlayStation Vita, almost like a natural evolution if Sony were to release a third version of that system. The white one in particular looks very clean, and I love the rounded edges. It makes this thing look very smooth and sleek. I really like the look of it. However, I don't love the placement of the start and select buttons being right next to each other on the right. This is more of a personal preference thing because I'm used to the select button being on the left, so it's mainly a muscle memory thing. At the same time, both the Vita and PSP had start and select together like this, so I can't really fault them for it. The thumbsticks are very similar to the Vita, in fact almost identical to the thumbsticks on my white OLED Vita here. The main downside here is that they are very short, which gives them a very short range of motion for analog controls. And when you want to tilt the stick just a little bit to walk, for example in something like Mario 64, you have a very small, precise amount of space to tilt the stick before you go from walking to running. This thing is pretty comfortable thanks to the rounded edges around the sides and the thickness. It's thicker than the PS Vita LCD 2000 model and about as thick as the OLED 1000 model, which I prefer. As much as I love the Vita, it was never all that comfortable for me, mainly because of the hand positioning when using the left thumbstick. But with most retro games, you're most likely to be using the D-pad, which is much more comfortable. Altogether though, I feel like the buttons and the layout are pretty good. I like how this thing is put together. My version here did include a 64GB micro SD card in the box, which is advertised to have around 10,000 games, but we're gonna get into how that's only kind of true. This thing does have a lot of games out of the box though, and you're able to run systems like Atari, NES, SNES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, PS1, N64, Dreamcast, and even PSP and Nintendo DS. When first loading up the system, you'll be greeted by the Best tab, which has a few pre-made collections of games, arcade vertical shooters, Famicom multicarts, which is kinda neat, and a collection of all the Pokemon games that this system comes with. I have not added any of my own ROMs, so what you see here is what you get. There are some bootlegs, which is kind of funny, as well as some ROM hacks if you're into those. Using the shoulder buttons to navigate along the top, you have your Favorites tab, where any games that you favorite will appear, your Recents tab, which shows the most recent games you've played, and then the Game tab is sort of the main page where you'll find all the consoles supported so you can get into all the collections of games. Again, this thing is said to have about 10,000 games or so, but there is a lot of bloat here, like multiple versions of the same game for different regions, and things like the Super Nintendo section having a ton of great looking RPGs that are all in Japanese, so if you can't read Japanese, these are all going to be pretty much useless. I recommend relying on the search feature to look for specific games that you want to play and favoriting those by pressing the menu button and adding to favorites. It'll make it a lot easier to just get to what it is you want to play. The UI did take a little getting used to for me at first, but ultimately I do like it. It's functional and it looks pretty nice. Continuing along the top, we have App, where you'll see the function key option. Here you can program the function switch on the bottom to do a number of things. I have mine set to toggle the RGB lighting on or off. There's also a USB storage feature and 2048, if anyone remembers that old mobile game, and there's a user guide. Then in settings, you can adjust your screen brightness, turn on Wi-Fi, and so on. Another thing that's already awesome out of the box with this thing is it has a true sleep function. You press that power button while it's on, it's gonna go to sleep and it's not gonna die while it's asleep. Now, if you're new to retro handhelds, you might think, isn't that kind of a given? But it's not. That whole like Nintendo Switch function of pressing the power button and it goes to sleep and doesn't die super fast, that's kind of not really a thing with a lot of these lower end consoles. The Miyoo Mini Plus, the RG35XX, and that whole lineup, I mention those because they're among the most popular under $100 retro handheld emulators, and out of the box, they don't have a working sleep mode. That's one of the reasons that people say to install those custom firmwares, is because it'll have a better sleep mode that will conserve battery. But out of the box, this thing will just save battery while it's asleep. It actually goes to sleep. I was playing with this thing and it had around 95% battery life, and I decided to put it to sleep for a couple hours to test it out and see what the battery life would be like later on in the day, and it was only down to 92%. Like, I've left this thing asleep and untouched for like a day or two, and it only died maybe like 10 to 20% in that time. Honestly, if I were to do that with something like the Miyoo Mini Plus out of the box, if I left that thing asleep overnight, it would be dead by morning. As far as performance, it's a pretty powerful device, but it's not super powerful. It's definitely not going to compete with anything like the Retroid Pocket devices or the Ein Odin. I mean, this is a sub $100 device, so it's going to perform right around the range of something like the RG35XXH or the Powkiddy RGB30. In fact, I would say of those two, this one probably performs a little bit better for me, more consistently than those would on some of the higher end 3D systems, but it's not fully consistent. N64 games, they just work, and they work pretty well, at least so far in my testing running a few games, even faster games like F-Zero. That is not my experience that I had with the RG35XXH or the RGB30. Those definitely had some weird performance issues with N64 at first, until I go deep diving into the settings and change a few things. Finally got those to work a bit. This worked out of the box without having to do anything. Dreamcast also works pretty good, but I feel like it worked better on the RG35XXH. It doesn't run poorly, but it just feels like it's not quite as smooth as it was there. However, PSP seems to work great. Most of the devices that can emulate PSP come with God of War Chains of Olympus, and that's my usual go-to test game to see how well it can run PSP games, and most of them, even though they include the game out of the box, really can't run it well. But I gotta say, it does run okay here. Not perfect. There's definitely some dip in the frame rate, but it's definitely playable, and PSP games look great taking full advantage of this larger screen. Games that don't run in 16:9 like NES, Game Boy, and so on will be scaled well out of the box without needing to mess around with a bunch of scaling and settings and whatnot, and for a lot of them there's these kind of neat overlays to fill in the space to the left and right so you don't have just black bars, but if you want to, you can go into the RetroArch menu and disable those and just have the black bars. Now this does run DS and it runs okay, except it's kind of hard hard to play anything. First of all, this is not a touchscreen, which already makes it difficult, but I'd say DS is a little bit more playable on something like the RGB30, at least out of the box. On this thing, the screens are set to side by side only, and out of the box, none of the buttons, it's usually the shoulder buttons, will let you toggle which screen is in focus or toggle the layout of the two screens, and none of that is working for me. There's also nothing programmed for touching the screen. Usually I'll click in one of the thumbsticks or something and that will touch the screen. None of that is set up out of the box, and that's not something I'm gonna do for this because I'm just gonna move on. So it turns out select or the R2 is going to be your touch button, but it's still not configured correctly, and I still can't get it to show the screens differently. Okay, I'm starting to think that this one that I got, which was shipped to me from Amazon, was maybe a return, because that or the configuration for Drastic, the DS emulator, is just really weird out of the box. A and B were not mapped to anything, so that's why I was having such a hard time getting Mario Kart to work a second ago. Then I just changed the controls to default and it worked, and it's a lot better. Still doesn't run great, but at least it's a little more playable. And that is the Trimui Smart Pro for you. One of my favorite retro handheld emulators that I've reviewed so far, and honestly it's pretty exciting. If you do want to pick this up, again, I will have an affiliate link in the description. It helps the channel a ton if you want to use that and support the channel in that way. But if you don't plan to pick it up, or you don't want to use my link, that's fine. There's stuff you can do totally free to help support the channel as well. Like this video, leave a comment telling me why you liked it or what you like about the Trimui Smart Pro. Maybe you're not picking it up, let me know why in the comments. Maybe there's something better out there that you'd like to recommend. So yeah, like this video, dislike it if you didn't, share with a friend, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and check out one of these other videos that I'll have here, and you can watch it there. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'm gonna end this video without an awkward stall at the end where I don't know what to say and I just kind of ramble on until the time runs out. It's something I usually do, but I'm gonna really try not to do that this time.